look over change over time, one consistent thing is should is oftentimes is non-existent as always and never, right? Not to say that should never exist or, it's always present. I think that's just something that's just super, it's humbling, it's grounding, it's oftentimes disconcerting and unsettling, but it's the ground in which we stand, and it's what we have to work with, right? And to the other part of her phrase, ifs don't exist. And, we can be speculative about history and say, if Robespierre and Détente didn't fight once they got in control, or Pancho Villa didn't fight once they got land, right? We can throw all these ifs out, but ultimately we're forced with what was. And we can use that again as grounding to move forward. I probably talked far too long, so I will leave it on for the next person.
I really appreciate it, Jason. And I think that there's a really beautiful thread that's being pulled here between what Laura was talking about in creation stories and oral traditions, and what you were speaking to with your familial lineages and how we're talking about history. I'm going to shift over to Adrian with a very similar question. You have very many different dimensions to your work, Adrian. You are the former president of the Agricultural History Society. You co-direct an oral history project, and you've written extensively on farming and rural life. What's the significance of history to you in the dimensions of food and land?
Well, thank you. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conversation and, introducing me really to Jason Porter and Laura Manthe, because I am blown away by their work. And so it's just an honor to be able to speak with people. And in the wonderful city of Milwaukee, which I used to visit as an undergraduate. I went to Northwestern, but one of my best friends was from Milwaukee. So I visited there quite often with her. But anyway, to your question, I think that I can't say it as eloquently as Jason just did, but as a historian, as a teacher, one of my goals is always to get my students and to get anyone I, have the pleasure of coming into contact with to question what they take for granted. And I think history has a wonderful way of getting people to, forcing people really to lift the ground that they're standing on, to use the metaphor that Jason was, to think about, to look at our world and not take for granted that that's the way it always has been and that that's the way it always needs to be. And so, in these discussions about food and land, it's essential that people understand the ways that agriculture has changed, the way that, in that it's a process of an enclosure movement, enclosure of land, rural societies losing access to the means of subsistence. That's a process that's still ongoing throughout the world, but that has really touched every part of the world in successive, times. And so that's one of the main things that I try to get across to my students, not to take for granted that things have always been the way that they were. And I came to that myself pretty late, because I was an aspiring journalist when I was in college. I went to the Medill School of Journalism, and I just wanted to be a newspaper reporter. And I had a newspaper job. I was here in Virginia, where my family's from, and but in Roanoke, and which is where we're from. And I was covering a county, Franklin County, rural county in Southwest Virginia. And I was called upon to do stories about tobacco farmers at the time when the tobacco settlement was going on. We're trying to come to terms with the health consequences of cigarette smoking. And I was exposed, or had to question, a lot of assumptions I had about farming. My South Carolina part of my family was involved in farming very recently. All of them were involved in farming at some time, but I still had memories of visiting my grandparents on their farm. And even though I did that, I never questioned really, why didn't my mother return to the farm where she grew up? Why didn't her brothers and sisters stay around? Why wasn't the farm operating after my grandfather passed away? And I didn't think about connecting all of these threads until I became a reporter and was forced to explain to the public, why are these tobacco farmers still around? Why are they still engaged in this work? And how is it that they survived given the changes that I was finding out about? So that's what prompted me to go to graduate school in the first place. And so I don't expect everybody to go pursue a PhD in history, but I do want, the more we can get people to question and to think through the world that we inhabit and how it came to be, the more we can kind of sort out the various challenges that we're facing.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. I want to bridge the conversation that we kind of just started having and expand a little bit and maybe talk about a few case studies maybe that come to each of our minds as we're thinking about the significance of history and historical storytelling and understanding connections between food and land. So if we're going to do a deep dive and try to understand our current situation, particularly in the United States today, in producing and accessing food as well as the land that we need to grow it, what are some moments we need to keep in mind and maybe keep interrogating? And I leave that open to whoever wants to answer first. But if we wanted to go around again, I don't know if Laura, you have any particular things we need to keep in mind when we're interrogating this history.
Sure, I'll go first. So, excuse me. So for our group, like a little historical perspective of Ohe-Lagu, we started out as individual backyard farmers, just growing little 10 by 10 spots of white corn, and would routinely get wiped out by raccoons in one night. So you spend all summer nurturing your plants and growing them, and you're really excited about having some corn, and then one night they come and wipe you out. So then my daughter and I collectively talked with other tribal members from other tribes in New York, and we decided that we should return back to our old original teachings, and that is to grow together cooperatively. And so I approached our Oneida Land Commission and asked them if we could have a few acres to grow on. We have a lot of farmland here in Oneida yet, and it's very rural. Most of the farmland is rented out to non-Indian farmers, and that's to pay the taxes on the land. So the Land Commission or land personnel said, well, you can rent land from the tribe, but it's $200 an acre. And I was like, well, that seems like a lot because we don't even know what we're doing. We don't know how much land we need. We're not going to make any money doing this. I don't think that $200 is really going to work for me. So then we had a community meeting that was supported by some grant work that we wrote. And the 4-H organization here in Oneida had an extra field that they weren't using, and they offered it to us, and it was 13 acres. And so then we had to go back to the Land Commission and get a lease in our name for that property. And that really set us on our road to success. So in our traditional cultural way of growing our corn, we have 3 clans. We have a bear and a turtle and a wolf clan. And the women would all plant together, and they would sing songs to the plants. The kids would be out there helping, multi-generational. And they would plant 1 row for the bears, and then 1 row for the turtles, and then 1 row for the wolves. And then they would go back to the 2nd row for the bears, 2nd row for the turtles, and 2nd row for the wolves. And the reason that they had to do it that way is because you didn't want to plant all of your good seeds in the bear field and then the turtle field and then have nothing left for the wolves. So everything that we did had to be very democratic, and we all had to practice politics continuously to live in harmony with each other. And so when we had our community meeting, we had 75 people show up, and we talked about soil health with one of the professors from our technical college as our guest speaker. And then we had a really nice potluck lunch, and then we asked everyone who wanted to stay behind that was interested in growing white corn cooperatively in our community to stick around, and we had 15 families stick back of the 75 people there. And that's how our group got started. And so without the assistance of the 4-H and the Oneida Land Commission to get a free lease for land, without the assistance of our community members who had seeds that they let us use, none of us had seeds. None of us knew what we were doing. So all of these things had to come together in order for us to be successful. So our first year we planted together, we harvested 1,500 pounds of corn. And this year we hand harvested between 12 and 15,000 pounds of corn. So that just tells you how much we've grown in the last 7 years.
That's an incredible story, and just it reminds us of the materiality of growing food and accessing food and those things that we really need to keep in mind, that relationship with the soil and how it's predicated on understanding of what a democratic process looks like, and reaching back into the traditions of Oneida in your case is really, really special in my mind. It's a really interesting case study. Is there anything else you want to add before I see if Jason or Adrian would like to respond?
Just one last thing. In that community meeting, in my mind, we were going to have like a community garden where everybody had their spots. And then my friend Don stood up and said, no, we're not doing community garden style. We're going to grow this together. We're going to harvest this together, and we're going to eat this together. And so then I had to decolonize my mind to stop thinking about ownership and space and think of it, everything belongs to everyone all the time.
It beautifully links up to what Adrian was talking about the history of enclosure and how that becomes so ingrained in our understandings of land and food today. Thank you so much. Jason or Adrian, do you have responses to Laura, or would like to tackle this question of the moments we need to keep in mind, either historical moments or processes that are happening on the ground now as you're doing your ethnographic and historical research projects?
I can go on.
You like to go? You go, please go. Please
okay.
go.
Thanks, Adrian. Thanks,
I was
Adrian.
referring to you, Jason. First of all, I'm so moved by what Laura just shared with us, because I think that one thing that her kind of testimony and experience points to is the need to stop treating Indigenous people as though they're people of the past, and as though we can only learn from things that, were going on in the past. No, they're people who have kept alive and are keeping alive and are, living, breathing, doing stuff every day to make the world a better place. And so I think, let's start with just trying to think about what's going on today in the here and now in cultures that haven't gotten the kind of, that haven't been turned to as experts. We have this whole agricultural, industrial kind of complex that's been predicated on certain types of knowledge, and the very knowledge that has destroyed or is destroying our climate. And that's completely unsustainable. So that would be one of the first things I think we can definitely learn from Laura. And then putting my traditional historian hat back on to look at a specific era and moment, I think that, we can start by making sure that people understand enough about the New Deal and the tremendous changes that brought about in both in the federal government's role in what we eat and how we use land and how we do or don't take care of that land. And also just again, in us trying to tackle the problems that we're confronting now, because we're really in this dreadful kind of cycle or loop of advocating reforms that really accommodate industrial and capital intensive agriculture rather than, completely overhauling it, which is what needs to happen. I think a lot of people agree that that's what we need to do, but there isn't the will to do that. So a starting point would be to think about what the New Deal was intended to do, what it ended up accomplishing in the world of agriculture in particular and the environment, and then trying to really think about the consequences of federal intervention, the good and the bad. I'm not saying it was all terrible, but there were some really devastating consequences. And I can go, I mean, I don't want to bore the audience, but I could go on and on about I'll talk give one example just specifically from my work. And so my book, Standing Their Ground, focused on small tobacco farmers in southeastern North Carolina. They grew tobacco as a cash crop, but they were also very much engaged in subsistence farming for a very long time. And part of the big question that I had about these farmers was not so much what were the forces that pushed them off the land, but it was how did they manage to stay on as long as they did, and why did they try to preserve that way of life as long as they did, given the way things were changing around them? So I think a lot of times our focus is on, especially when it comes to Black farmers, every time you open a popular publication, there's the land loss stories, which are important, because dispossession is a huge part of the story, and not just dispossession of Black farmers. However, how is it that any of them remain? We have something like 40,000 Black farmers in the United States. We only have 2.2 million American farmers overall. We know that a great deal of American agriculture is large scale corporate farming, but we still have people who are determined, or just at least try their best to hang on with very small operations. What motivates them? Why do they continue to do this? And I think that if we have more dialogue about, why would someone want to remain in that kind of lifestyle? That also could help inform us about, what can we do to get more people engaged in the type of cooperative efforts that Laura was just talking about? Because I think that that's going to be the key to trying to reform or kind of revolutionize our food system.
I really appreciate this conversation and how it's moving along here. Looking at the roots of cooperation, I really appreciate these really specific case studies too, Adrienne, just for people to kind of link up to. And I noticed in the chat there were some people who were asking questions. I promise we will get to the chat and look at the questions. And if anyone wants a clarification or some more details about what we're talking about, we're going to leave some of that for the last 20 minutes of the session. So I really appreciate that. But I also really liked in the very beginning, we're problematizing the process of history or the study of history itself too. When we're thinking about the past, we also need to remember there are these incredible things that are happening now, and they can be informed with what was happening in the past, but it's important to carry both and balance both together in a very careful and intentional way. So I really appreciated that threading together with Laura's points. Jason, would you like to add and to continue with this conversation of what moments we need to keep in mind and interrogate?
Yeah, I'll do a series of moments carrying it through Mexico. But first, I would like to just thank Adrienne and Laura for their points. They really resonated with me in thinking about my own family's history with land in the eastern shore of Maryland and Snow Hill. My great-great-grandfather, Charles A. Spencer, was one of the first Black men to own land in Maryland, and we still have part of it. And we were truck farmers during the New Deal and tried to do a series of different things to keep on it, but lost a lot during industrialization into the state throughout the 70s and 80s. And now we just have a small bit. And I'm very excited that I'll be starting a job in Maryland. Hopefully I can get that going. But okay, so love that we talked a little bit about the Indigenous perspective and the Black perspective. I'm going to try to combine the two by talking a little bit about Mexico I think Mexico is really important and just kind of thinking about the moments that we are in. So I'll start with 1848, when the United States and Mexico finish a war where the United States gets 40% of Mexican land that goes all the way out to the Pacific. Our whole, as a country in the United States, our whole narrative and, existence around settler colonialism and expansion towards the West and displacement of indigenous communities trying to think about the expansion of slavery. Ultimately, the Civil War starts with that moment. And I think that's really important to remember. Another moment with Mexico, I think is important to remember, is the moment of arsenic in the wake of slavery. So in the wake of in the wake of enslavement in the US South, basically cotton planters had to figure out a new way to basically destroy plants, or destroy pests, and to basically revitalize new land, because they didn't have enslaved labor to go out and cut down new trees or pick new bugs off of plants. So they invested in chemicals. And you see this across Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, large state and planter investments in chemicals. One of the largest ones is actually arsenic. A lot of that arsenic is actually a byproduct of copper and silver mining that's actually taking place in Mexico around like the expansion of railroads and expansion of mining in the West during that same period. We're talking like the 1880s, 1890s, right? So a lot of that arsenic that is a byproduct of copper and silver mining is being sent to manufacturers to produce three things: paint, about 5%, glass, about 20%, and pesticides, about 75%. Our FDA, pesticides were such a big part of our economy around early fruits and around cotton in the turn of the 20th century, that the original FDA was actually the FDIA, the federal for insecticides in there. So I think that's a really important moment to see how Mexico is really central in that. Another really important, I think, is Mexico had a revolution that ultimately reconfigured the relationship between land and small farm holders and collective farm holding, not just in Mexico, but throughout the Americas. But I do think there's an interesting story, and a good colleague and a mentor of mine, Nicole Moutier, writes about how at the very onset of agrarian reform in Mexico, a process that ultimately extended 43.5% of all arable land in Mexico to over 29,500 groups of collective farmers. We're talking not a small project, almost the largest project. Tierras Hirales, yes, exactly. Like, so that is, so in that process, but at its very onset, it is co-opted by capitalism, especially from the United States, that ultimately say, okay, fine, we lost the land, but as long as we can still get the products to commercialize in certain spaces, that's fine. So you have companies like Anderson Clayton, one of the largest cotton producers, who had transported its cotton empire from the US South into Mexico during the time I was speaking about. They're like, okay, we lost the land to farmers, but we can sell them the arsenic, we can sell them the fertilizers, we can sell them the tractors. And as long as we get the products and we're able to manufacture it, then we're good, right? And that early moment, that's what we see now with soy. That's what we see now with palm, where who owns the land doesn't matter. So long as who owns the market, who owns the technology, who owns the politics, right? So I think there's something really, really important there. And especially as you see now when we walk into a grocery store, we're very accustomed to seeing thousands of items come from three different products, right? Soy and corn and palm. But that type of process, that early kind of diversification or neoliberalization of our land, of our plants, of what we put into our body, starts much earlier. And to some extent with cotton, a scholar by the name of Helen Zoe Veit, and this is the last thing I'll say, kind of shows how in this moment where cotton profits are kind of dwindling because cotton is being grown everywhere. It's blowing up in Egypt. It's blowing up in India. It's blowing up in Mexico. It's blowing up in Brazil. Basically, you can't just sell cotton as textiles anymore to make money. You have to find how to diversify those profits. So cotton industrialists and planters started developing soaps out of cotton. They just started developing processed foods out of cotton. Have you ever heard of Crisco? Crisco until the 1980s was produced out of 100% cottonseed oil. Literally, the industry figured out a way to make people eat cotton in order to make it still profitable. So I think that type of, and I said I was going to say the last thing I was going to say, and I lied, because I think the one last thing I want to say about why Mexico is important is what kind of follows agrarian reform in the 1920s and 1940s, which is the Green Revolution. Those kind of the same kind of major companies like Anderson Clayton and the Rockefeller Foundation use Mexico as an experiment, as it always has been since the 1840s. Excuse me, it's always been that kind of experiment to test new forms of large-scale industrial agriculture, large-scale pesticide implementation, large displacement of communities. And they use this model and they implemented it in Bolivia. They implemented it in Colombia. They implemented it in China. They implemented, by they, I mean the US government. They implemented it in India, right? So again, Mexico becomes a model through which the United States exports agribusiness empire, right? So I just think, so as we try to, and Mexico is a country with 64 indigenous languages that are largely spoken now, and a robust Black community, right? So this is also a country that embodies both the conversations that we're talking about, around indigeneity and Blackness. But I just think, as I think it's important to see as the people in the United States focus on food and land justice, especially in a country right now where our largest producer of food is the Central Valley, mostly Mexican and Mexican-American laborers, highest rates of asthma because of the chemicals that are used in that area, the highest rates. I mean, we still have a country that still abuses Mexican labor and Mexican land, in a host of different ways. I said far too much. I'm so sorry.
No, it was so, I really appreciated the level of detail and the various different case studies that we can point to when thinking about the longer history and context, how we're coming to understand food and land justice efforts today, what we need to know, those foundations. And what I really appreciate across all of your answers is that we are talking about various different scales and various different stakeholders. So not just those are producers, but also consumers if they are not the same person. We're talking about neighbors and community members. We're talking about the federal government. We're talking about chemical companies, and also how those boundaries blur and disappear in some instances, but then come up and are solidified and made into those enclosures in other instances. And I think it's really important for us, all of us, to ask when those boundaries disappear and when they reappear, when thinking about resisting these larger scales that are involved in agriculture. And Jason, I'll just add to, before we move to the last question I have, and then going into your questions to each other, and then the questions in the chat. The other thing that I really appreciated was talking about this larger ecology that is international, that gets created in the 20th century, where these chemicals that are coming from Mexico are being repurposed, and you're seeing products being repurposed and diversified and used in different instances. That's something that I also look at in my own work. For those who are in the audience, I do a lot of research on animal feed and livestock feeding, and how various different products emerge to feed cattle back a lot of the chemicals that they also produce. So it's just this really interesting and fascinating discussion to balance what's happening on the ground with people, with our neighbors, how we're creating these democratic processes, and how we're managing that with all of these different products that we consume on a daily basis, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, because of this larger infrastructure that has been put in place over the last century. So I really appreciate that. And it links to this other question that I had that was a more direct one for all of you. We conducted a survey at the center, and it was clear from that survey that scholars and community leaders are really interested in trust, the idea of trust as a pressing issue of our time, how we might navigate current concerns of distrust, and also ideas of broken trust. I ask you all, can food, given all of these complexities, can food be a catalyst for fostering trust? And does trust come into your work at all? Maybe I'll move back to Laura and we'll just go another round robin again, unless someone else would like to jump in.
So that's a really good question too. So in our group, we post our own hours that we work with the corn. And we have a messenger page that's connected to our Facebook page. And we have actually people here working right now, working with the corn, getting it ready for the tribal elder food box that works with food pantries. And so every person in our group will post when they've worked with the corn and what project and what they did. So if they were weeding, they'll post how many hours they weeded, or how many hours they picked corn, or how many hours they husked it, or how many hours they braided it. And it's all on the honor system. Nobody checks on you to see if you actually have your hours in, because we work together so closely that we trust each other. So that is really, really important. We've also built up a lot of trust with our community. We trust that they're going to leave our fields alone and not pick our corn. We trust that when we give them a product, we share our corn with them, that they're going to be respectful with it, and they're going to appreciate what we bring to the community. And then there's reciprocity there. And yeah, so our whole group is based on trust. The Land Commission trusted us with the land. The community trusted us with their seeds. We trust each other with the amount of hours that we put in. So for every 50 hours that puts into the group, they get 1 share of corn. And then when they get their share of corn, they can do whatever they want with it. So when the corn is in the field, it's growing, it belongs to everyone. When it's hanging in the in braids, drying, it belongs to everyone. It doesn't actually belong to a person until they come and get their distribution. And even that's based on trust too. They take as many pounds as they're supposed to take. It's on the honor system.
Seeing trust built into the very makeup of the entire organization is really incredible. And I think something that we can all learn from. It can be challenging at times to think about trust, I think, but to see it in action day to day, something that's worked through, is really, really something incredible. Adrian, Jason, Adrian, if you want to talk a bit about trust. Is food the connector? From Laura's point, it seems like it is. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm so inspired by what Laura just said and what Jason said earlier. I think Laura offered a perfect model for thinking about how our existing community gardens, which exist all over the United States, and also encouraging that type of model, the kinds of ways that they can be built around ideas of trust, and how they can build solidarity between groups who don't always see themselves as having common interests. I think that's been one of the primary preoccupations in my work, is how do you, not that each group has its own particular histories and particular challenges around the question of food justice. But there are political issues of inequality that can unite Black people, Indigenous people, Latino people. So I think if we focus more on those things, and using food, using community gardening as one of many ways to bridge gaps and to create solidarity among people in their day-to-day social life, it might translate into political action. And I'll just give you one example from my work of where trust comes into my work. I'm currently putting the finishing touches on a book that's about Black farm owners, and it's based on an oral history project that Mark Schultz and I have been doing for about 10 years now. But a big part of understanding the history of African-American farmers in contemporary society has been understanding the 1999 Pigford versus Glickman class action suit, and that established that the United States Department of Agriculture had discriminated against Black farmers for years. And even though the suit was successful, there are many claimants in that suit who never have gotten justice. They've never gotten the damages that they were supposed to receive. And there's also just been ongoing discrimination toward Black farmers. This, mishandling of the settlement and the USDA even suing not to have to pay on the settlement really has created a lot of distrust on the part of Black farmers. So on top of just the distrust that had existed almost since the USDA's founding because of unequal funding of land grant colleges, because of unequal funding in terms of extension work. All of the years of discrimination have built up to create a tremendous amount of distrust on the part of Black farmers toward the USDA. The American Rescue Plan of 2021 included a loan forgiveness provision that was supposed to address some of these concerns and difficulties. And that was $4 billion in debt forgiveness that was supposed to benefit African American, Native American, Latino, Alaskan Native, Asian American, and Pacific Islander farmers. Unfortunately, a few white farmers sued the Secretary of Agriculture and charged that the debt forgiveness program had violated the Constitution and discriminated against white farmers. So the case was dismissed because the Biden administration was trying to work on an alternative plan. But in the meantime, you still have people who are kind of in limbo. You still have all of this trust, renewed reasons for being distrustful because their kind of concerns haven't been addressed. And to add insult to injury, if you look back at the Trump era COVID relief, a great portion of it went to corporate agriculture. Mm-hmm. So you have these continuing, baked into the system, inequality toward farmers. And that's why I say the whole thing kind of needs to be overhauled. But I'm convinced that you can't fully address the problems of the majority of Black farmers or farmers of other socially disadvantaged farmers, as they're referred to, without building solidarity among all American farmers, including white farmers. Because if you can't come from the standpoint that all white farmers are just, living the life of Riley. It's just not true. There are significant corporate interests, of course, and there's significant white family farmers who are doing quite well. But if we look at, the grand scheme of things, it's still the case that at least 40 to 50% of American farmers make less than a basic amount to make a decent living. They're farming and they're also having to do other activities. So I think trust is essential for, on the scale of American agriculture, rebuilding trust is hugely important. And I think you do that through trying to build more solidarity. I hope I didn't go on too long.
No, not at all. This is a great point. And speaking to, I appreciated how these lawsuits, this legal language, it's baked into how people readdress and reapproach these challenges of trying to gain more resources. And when there is this resource battle across different groups, that fosters distrust. And I think that that's something that absolutely we need to keep in mind. And again, pointing to Laura's model of trust being baked into a system, what does that look like, and where do we start? It's for building that solidarity that you so lovely, you put it such a beautiful way. Jason, would you like to add to this discussion about trust and where it fits?
Yeah, no doubt, of course. I really appreciate everything was said, and I'm not going to try to be a contrarian at all because I think trust is essential. I also think trust takes time, and food might be too fast. It might be more agriculture than food. It might be more growing than eating, you know? I'm even thinking about, you know, a conversation about how to grow cucumbers. That would take that to trust, you know, let's say you're growing cucumbers in North Carolina. You couldn't necessarily trust someone's practices of growing cucumbers in Ohio, right? Because the soil is different, the climate's different, all this type of thing. So trust, I feel like historically, oftentimes lends itself to things like quantification and standardization, and oftentimes can be weaponized. And I'm not a religious person, so I'm not advocating necessarily for faith, but I do think faith matters too. And I think oftentimes what we're talking about, especially when our interactions with each other, is having faith, you know, in one another. But one thing I would also try to say is and going back to trust, I do think, and it's interesting because I think while I wanted to have faith in I was trying to listen to my own ideas because everything that Adrian and Laura said was so thought-provoking, and I was trying to think of things, but you had to have faith in what they were saying, right? To just stop listening and just, so I'm sorry if I sound incoherent right now, but I really was trying to be in the practice of listening, which I think is really tough sometimes, right? And I think that's sometimes a practice that we need to have as advocates, to have faith in one another and to try to like click off and not necessarily always focus on what you're going to say next. But I do think one thing I thought initially was I think international law has a lot of holes, but I think something that's really interesting is you see chemical law is so different across countries, right? You have a lot of people come from Europe that come to the United States, and they're offended that there are so many chemicals in our food that aren't allowed in food in Europe. Right now, there are over 99 chemicals allowed for use in Mexico that aren't allowed for use in the United States. So as you move across borders, we talk about things passing borders and borders aren't permeable, or borders are permeable. We have countries that create chemicals that they know can't be used in their countries to be sold in other places. That's what we do in the United States. We produce chemicals that we know we can't use in our country, and we sell them other places. So I do think in terms of thinking about food policy, thinking about global international health, there could be some really cool trust to establish around international chemical policy, especially on pesticides, especially on insecticides, especially because a lot of that data is driven by communities, right? We have communities from Colombia to the Central Valley of California developing their own data on who has asthma, who's getting it, they're testing their soil qualities, they're taking it to universities. A lot of that data is not necessarily being driven by institutions, by being driven by communities, especially in the realm of anti-pesticides. So I think there's some possibility there, to have some really community-driven international law that really bans real chemicals everywhere, as opposed to saying they're legal in one state, as opposed to, it's like our marijuana laws here in the United States, which are just outlandish and penalize the most vulnerable people. So that's really what I want to say, is that little bit on I'm just musing here and throwing out that possibility that could be something to think about in terms of international chemical law. But I also think that thinking about faith and is also super, super important too. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Jason, because when we get to the next roundtable, Trust in Theory, we will be talking about spirituality and faith a little bit, as it speaks to philosophy and the undercurrents and the foundations of what builds trust and creation of trust. So I think that our hints and how we're researching and thinking about this and talking about this together, I think that there's definitely room for talking about faith. I also was really fascinated in all of your accounts by these two frames of trust. We hear this phrase quite a bit, moving at the speed of trust, but we also talked a lot about scales of trust. I think the scalability conversation that's happening between the three of you is really fascinating, going from the very localized relational one-to-one with a very specific plot of land, with a very specific plant, very specific neighbors, then trying to scale up into a state, into a nation, into a continent, into global policy, it's harder the more people that are involved. And I think that's something that we're attending to. But Jason, your point of community-driven data and having using community-driven data, like pulling on those localities that Laura was speaking to, and really scaling them up through crowdsourcing in this way is really a fascinating argument and discussion for how we might execute trust to make some change or difference or place it into action for the case of food and land justice efforts, which is really fascinating. I'm looking at the time here, and we have about 30 minutes left in the session, and I want to make sure that we have time for discussions and questions in the chat. I think that we might have time for one of Adrian's questions and one of Jason's questions. Jason, you had a few questions for both Adrian and Laura. Since you're on the floor, do you want to ask one of those questions? Did one resonate with you? Or I hate to put you on the spot.
I would have to look at the, hold on, let me find it on the sheet real quick. Hold on. Do you have a suggestion on the first or the third question? You pick one of those two.
I think the third question was really powerful. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. Adrian and Laura, I have this question for you. What is the role of storytelling, listening, and humility in first questioning institutional authority, and then establishing new, flexible, and living forms of community certified trust?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I guess that would have to go to, changing the way that our land commission dealt with us, from wanting to charge us $200 per acre to getting a free lease on the 4-H property. And then from that lease, we've actually gotten quite a few more little properties that other farmers didn't want. And now we're up to 35 acres that we're managing and rotational growing. And so, that, I think that's a good example of like the community part of it, because we're all community members here, and we have to work together, and we are feeding our community with the food that we grow. So that would be my answer.
Adrian, same question.
Thinking that one. Well, I'll tell you, I was really, not to answer a question you didn't ask, but I was really struck by the religion question, the other question.
Go for it.
I immediately had some, but I think they can be related, because one of the things one of the things I'm thinking when it comes to storytelling and listening and using that as a way to hopefully try to build some trust, but also to lead to more substantive change, is I think that if people can begin to tell their stories of food and land justice, and even if those stories have a spiritual or religious dimension to them, which they often do, I think that also is another way of creating those kinds of connections and building the trust that we're talking about, at least on the local level. I take your point about the difficulty of having these conversations and across states, across nations, but I do think that that's possible too. But just to give one example, I mean, I think what Laura is doing in being engaged year in, year out with a community of people, what even I do in the classroom, what Nicole does in the classroom, and Jason, those are important points of connection that we have such a huge opportunity to convey things and have our students listen to each other, and hopefully have them extend that in among their families and into their communities. I mean, I often have this conversation with people about the very notion of public intellectuals and public historians, because I think that that's not a role that I have sought after, because I really enjoy the process, even if it's just over 13 or 15 weeks, of getting to know my students and building trust with them and being able to expose something to them that maybe they'll begin to trust with me and hopefully carry with them. Whereas I think if I write an op-ed or something, I'm like, how those people, they don't know me. They don't have any reason to listen to what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is, I think that in our own communities, wherever we are, you know, bring a religious dimension to it, we have the opportunity to proselytize, whether that is in a Christian way or just in a non-secular way, but we have the opportunity to really expose our students, to get them to question things and to share with each other, to listen to each other in the way that Jason was talking about, you know, really stopping and trying to process what that person is saying, even if you don't agree. It's not about you right now. Listen. So I really think that that's powerful. Just like the conversation that you're having right now, we have 88 participants here right now, 88 attendees who have taken time out of their day just to listen to what we're saying. And that's very powerful. I hope they are getting something out of it. But the point is, the more that we can listen to one another and come together over issues that are very important to us, I think the better off we'll be in trying to come up with some ideas that lead to, I keep coming to political action. It has to be on the level of people coming together and pushing people in power to do, you know, what we think needs to be done.
I have a quick, did you have a response, Laura?
Well, yeah, I didn't really touch on the storytelling part of it.
Oh, go for it.
So, you know, at the beginning, I talked about the creation story, and I talked about the Great Law of Peace, and I talked about the Code of Handsome Lake. And so the thing that I think really makes our group really successful is that we all understand what our responsibilities are as Ungwehue, or original people. So we all have a really firm grasp of our own culture and our own identity and the responsibility of taking care of the corn. And so then it's easier for us to learn the songs that go with it and go to the ceremonies that are set aside just for the corn, and to relate to other Haudenosaunee people in New York as our mentors, because we have a really basic understanding of what we have these original instructions to give thanks for things. We have like a Thanksgiving address that we give. So our spirituality isn't really religious, but it's entwined with everything that we do in the way that we conduct ourselves. Another point that I wanted to make earlier, but I didn't get a chance to after listening to you guys talk, was how we trade our corn with other Native nations for maple syrup and wild rice and fish. And so we're reconnecting the trade routes with other tribes in the Great Lakes area around the value of the corn. And so then we're building trust with each other that we're going to give each other products that are healthy and safe.
Thank you very much for that, that point. Building off of that, and also Adrian's point earlier, connecting the storytelling to listening. One thing that's going on at the institute that I work at, the Institute of Environment and Society at Brown, is there's a center for climate obfuscation run by a professor of sociology by the name of C21's. And I think it's really important work because they're interested in a largely conservative, oftentimes religious group, mostly here in the United States, that oftentimes is pushing an agenda against climate change and that it's happening. And I think that's so important. And you guys should all look up his work, should all look into that, and we should all support kind of the stories we tell in the narration, how we communicate science is important, and how scientists communicate is important. But at the same time, I think we can be more affirmative. And I think that's oftentimes thing that we can always be in storytelling, is try to tell more affirming stories. And I think, Adrian, you were talking about this earlier, right? In terms of thinking about Black relations with land, not necessarily always rooted in loss, right? But rooted in other types of stories about what we held on to and things like that. I think that's so essential. And one kind of to this point on to pivot off of the obfuscation is we live in a world that's deeply religious. Something like 60-70% of the world is deeply religious, and even more people are deeply spiritual, right? Yet when religion and spirituality enter our narratives around climate or around land or around environmental justice, they're discredited for some reason. And I think if we don't figure out an effective way to communicate climate narratives, environmental narratives, land justice narratives more effectively to religious and spiritual people, I don't know what we're doing, because we need not create this battle like we're battling this gigantic conservative conglomerate that's everywhere around the world that doesn't believe in climate change, that taints the narrative that religious people don't believe in these narratives, don't believe in these stories, don't believe in this fight. I come from a very religious family that has always been politically active and has always been, has believed in, these types of affirming changes. So I just think as we tell these stories, we can be more affirmative about, the people, to whom we're speaking, and their perspectives around they're coming from, and kind of carry that kind of humility in it, regardless of whether or not religious point. But I just really appreciated how Adrian brought back in that part of the other question into the other one. So I wanted to address it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I again, this will tie in to the next conversation that we have in March as well, where we have at least one panelist. One panelist is linked to Soulfire Farms, which takes on a very spiritual and religious approach to thinking about their farming and their landscape. Sherry Rivers also does quite a bit of work thinking about imagined futures and various different philosophies that get intertwined in understandings of the land. And so, and then Martise Scales being part of that conversation from Full Circle Healing Farms just outside of Milwaukee here. So this is, it's lovely to see this arc already happening as we're in anticipation for the next month of discussion, which I hope that we find a way that we're all like talking to each other about that intersection. I'm seeing that there are actually quite a few questions in the chat, and some of them are really focused on each of your individual expertise. So I want to get to these as we're wrapping up the session. And if you're still online here with us, I welcome you to use the chat function and ask a question of any of our panelists here in this roundtable. Focused on food justice, land justice, history, or the concept of trust as we're exploring here today. So we did have one question that was specifically for Laura. Laura, thank you for your wisdom. You talked about soil health. Have you had your soil checked for PFOs and pollutants? So that was like a very pointed question that was speaking to materiality and seeing and talking about the soil health. If you could answer that question.
Sure. So when our tribe reacquires property from other farmers that are selling property on the reservation, we have to have land tested by our team. They have to do a land use plan. If it's identified for farming, then our big Oneida Nation farm can use it first. They have cattle that they graze, and they also have a bison farm. If they decide that the property is too small or it doesn't fit their needs, then it goes to our June Hinkle farm, which is our organic farm. And if they don't have a need for it, then we get the leftovers. So we also work with an agronomist that our environmental health and safety program pays for. And so they'll do soil testing on the soil again, and now they're looking at the nutrient value and finding out what kind of nutrients that we need to add to our soil. I am a big fan of organic chicken crumbles. I think it's a really great fertilizer. We also use composted manure from friends that have horses. So we make sure that it's aged quite a bit so that we're not growing, invasive species or whatever plants in our fields. And then we also spray on fish emulsion, organic fish emulsion, onto the plants growing. So we try to keep all of our production in organic standards because we're eating the food.
Fantastic, thank you. And that question was from Tracy Doreen. We also have a question from Imelda Roman. Adrian, was there a common theme on the farmers' answer as to why they held on to their farming? Going back to your introduction and talking about some of the case studies you went over.
It's so funny. I was thinking about this as Jason was speaking last, because on the question of religion, because a lot of people said things like they're not making any more land, or God's not making any more land. Like that was a very common answer as to why people held on to their land. Whether they kept farming it or not is a different issue. But in terms of the people who continue to farm, it's funny, they would say things that made them stand out as special. Like, I just work hard, or, our family was different. We learned, so there's an ideological dimension to it. Even when the farmers acknowledge that things have changed, so things have gotten tougher, you can't farm unless you have a lot of money. But so when they're thinking about why they stayed and what has enabled them to stay, they fall back on a lot of their own ideas about success and failure. And I think it's very interesting to think about in our society, the way that this capitalist language of success and failure gets caught up in all of it. But on a more basic level, most of them say that a common theme is that they just enjoy being outdoors, they enjoy nature, they enjoy even though we could argue that agriculture is not nature, but anyway, they enjoy being outdoors, they enjoy producing things, seeing things grow, and being able to work for themselves, being able to be their own boss. Those are some of the common answers that I've gotten from people. So I guess there's two different things, why they want to stay, but also how they explain their ability to stay. Has been fascinating for me to think through. And of course, I have a completely different interpretation of these things than they do. But I think that's where what Jason was talking about earlier, about no matter what your thoughts are about it, honoring and being respectful and listening to the way that people tell their own story, and then being able to our obligation as academics or intellectuals is to analyze what they say, but we can still do that with a great deal of reverence for the people themselves and their unique ideas.
Thank you, Adrian. I have another question here, and I believe it's directed to Jason from Andrew Wareheim. And I'm sorry to all in the audience if I'm completely obliterating the pronunciation of your names here. So Jason, can you speak to the intersection between agriculture, indigenous land, Mexico, and the Zapatista movement, and how more movements like that may be able to bring change?
Yeah, so I am no expert on the 1990s Zapatistas that started in the 1994, but I have studied the Zapatistas of the Mexican Revolution extensively, and I think they, as the original Zapatistas, are for me a wee bit more inspirational. But it's interesting. I think what ultimately, I don't want to say limited both of them, because I think their commitment to the local is what has made them so powerful, but it's also what has, to some extent, limited their expansion beyond. So in the Mexican Revolution, Emiliano Zapata, which it's named after, basically took control over an entire state of Morelos and started agrarian reform or land distribution long before it actually started at the national scale in 1917 through law, but really through practice in the 1930s. But Zapata was not interested in Mexican Revolution for all of Mexico. He was interested in Mexican Revolution for Morelos, for the communities around him. And I think that's a really important thing to remember in revolutions is it's hard to convince people as radical as they are on the other side of the mountain to fight for your side of the mountain, you know, and because ultimately they're not going to live there. So I think as we move, I mean, when we study revolutions, we usually study them from the national perspective, the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, the Chinese, the Russian, Cuban, Mexican. And I think the revolutions that we will see and the revolutions that we need going forward are going to be much more local in orientation, like the Zapatista movements. I mean, the Zapatistas, Emiliano was largely a reaction to U.S. Sugar growing industries in Morelos, and they were pushing against that. So that's kind of the major connections. But I could go on, and I don't necessarily know if it's going to be super pointed, but I made that point, and I hope it was good. But I would, Andrew, reach out, and we can talk Zapatistas, 1910s, 1990s all day.
Thank you. And Andrew says thank you. I'm also, there's this other question that just popped up in the chat, and I think it's for everyone to reflect on and to answer. What's a first step someone could take to begin nourishing trust in their community, like Milwaukee, since we're all sitting here in virtual Milwaukee, at least. Can you talk more about how to foster support for Black and Indigenous farmers in a community that is generally distrustful of the food and ag industry? And this is a question from Tegan Budney. I don't know who would like to tackle it first.
Sure. Okay, so this is Laura, and I would say that that any Native person who wants to, nourish trust should get to know the seeds of their people, and get to know the stories of their people, and then the responsibilities that go along with being taking care of those seeds, and then find like-minded people that have the same values and the same reverence for the foods, because every time a Native person plants a seed, it's an act of resistance to colonialism.
Thank you, Laura. Adrian, Jason.
It's hard because I think, I think what Laura said is very instructive, but also a point that Jason just made about, so much depends on people acting out of their own self-interest and convincing them to see more of a community interest. So who can you connect with, who you would trust enough to engage with in a way? And how do you, that is maybe where our discussion earlier about using food to foster trust among people. If we can get young people through community organizations that already exist, urban 4-H, community gardens that already exist, churches and other institutions, even trying to, this is going to sound crazy, but even trying to recruit young men and women who find themselves in gangs. We have to reach everybody. So can you do this? Is this a prison-based program? Is there some way everywhere we can bring people together in a collective manner in growing food and talking about food and trying to kind of break down a lot of the barriers that separate people? I know I sound very idealistic right now, but I just think that there's a way to, if we're serious about this and serious about trying to transform our food system, then getting people's hands in the soil, getting all kinds of people's hands in the soil, is very important. Not just the people who are already true believers, but people who need a little bringing along and can, maybe are distrustful, but can learn to trust and learn to be trustworthy through the process of getting, working together to achieve a common goal. Because that's one of the problems. A lot of us don't do that in our everyday lives anymore. We're away from the world of interdependence when it comes to, I noticed when you asked me the question, I was writing someone in the chat who said that her grandparents were tobacco farmers in Puerto Rico. And getting to that point, tobacco farms were very interdependent with all the people around them. And we have that to a certain extent in urban areas like Milwaukee, but it's not quite the same producer-based interdependence that you would have on farms. I'm not trying to romanticize farms at all, but that was one of the good things that did exist on a lot of farms and in a lot of farming communities. So I think we can try to bring some of that and build on what Laura has done in a much broader scale.
This is Jason speaking. Thank you so much, Laura, for reminding me about that practice, which I've forgotten to do this meeting. So I apologize for not saying my name before I speak. I think one thing that we can do, and one thing I'm going to do from this conversation, is I'm going to try to carry Adrian's practice of just acknowledging and just listening so carefully. I feel so acknowledged and listened to by how you've responded. I just appreciate it dearly. And I think that's something that we can do going forward, is going back to faith. I think, not to say it's easy to have faith in God or to have faith in spirits or whatnot, but I think we live in a world where it's really hard to have faith in people. We have things around us happening every day, all the time, that are just so discouraging and so disheartening that I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to be faith for someone else and try to reestablish that faith in people every day. And, you guys in front of me in this screen have helped reestablish some bit of faith in people today for me. And I hope I've done a little bit of that for you. I hope that, I had the barista this morning really liked my jacket. I cracked a little joke. We had a little thing. So I don't know if I've reestablished his faith in people, but I think that's something that we can do moving forward, is try to be that faith for other people, be that trust for other people moving forward. And I think that gets us out the house. Sometimes trust takes time. Try to go to the same place twice a week. Go to the library twice a week. Go to a cafe twice a week. Try to have that moment like, oh, I saw you other day with them shoes. Them shoes look real good. Try to be present in space. Be present with people. Listen and be attentive. And the last thing I'd say in regards to food, one thing I used to do, I was an environmental philosophy major and environmental science minor as an undergrad in Mississippi. And one thing I used to do, especially being in Mississippi, is such an agricultural state, such a state that was just surrounded by people not being beneficiaries of the hard work that they put into the land, is I would always, before I would eat, I would look at my plate. And in a very similar way, if y'all ever see that, y'all ever seen that painting by Renee Marguerite that says like, this is not a pipe, right? It's like, este no es un pipa. And then basically it's a thought experiment, right? That this is really a painting of a pipe. It's really the accumulation of an artist's time, not just creating this, but learning to create this, right? It's the accumulation of the different pigments that came from the different colors that were extracted by, different people in different parts of the world, that were manufactured in other parts of the world, that reached, some canvas on some day at a certain time. And I think that's something that we can do every single time before we eat, is look at our food and try to say, this is not just food. This is so many hands. This is so many places. This is so much energy. This is so much soil and sun and water and wind. This is so much that has come to me today. And I think that'll help you be the person you want to be as you interact. I can't think we can just assume that going out and establishing trust with other people is enough as if we're the people we want to be. We always have to be trying to become the people we want to be and understand our position and our place in the world. So that's a practice that I used to do for myself that I used to think was really helpful. Every single time I used to eat, think about who made the fork? Where was this mined? You know, what about this plate? Where did this come from? Is this porcelain? Where does this porcelain come? This is just a thought experiment that you can do to help situate yourself and where you are and help use food as a tool to help see how you are already so connected. You know, you are already so in touch with so much. You are already surrounded and loved, you know, and, you know, then it's on you to go out and spread where you can.
I'm about to start crying from what Jason has just been saying. Jason said he was not particularly religious, but he just gave a sermon.
Jason, that was so powerful. And there's so much in the chat. And it pains me to say this, but we need to wrap up. And so I just want to say thank you so much, everyone here that for this conversation. There was this question of like, how can we follow you and support your work? Just a reminder that we have a lot of the resources from each of these panelists and the panelists moving forward in our interactive book club portal. It includes all of the readings, including articles and books that these fine people have written or have been showcased in. Oheloku is also hyperlinked to that page as well. So if you would like to support that program, you can go to that website. So until then, so thank you. This roundtable is being recorded and it will be available online. Will also be available as a text publication at a later date, and I'll be in touch with all these panelists, and I hope you'll be in touch with us in that book club forum. So until then, we invite you to engage with these topics through our podcast, 6.5 Minutes with the book club, and our 2 upcoming conversations, Trust in Theory on March 30th, which I've talked about extensively, but also Trust in Action, which we'll talk more about some of the things that Laura was pointing to. How do we formulate trust and execute trust on the ground when food and land justice issues? That's on April 20th. We'll explore different dimensions of the modes of communication and addressing issues of food and land. So I hand it back to Emilio now to announce the Turner's events. Again, it pains me that's the end already.
Well, it was an absolutely brilliant event. My friends, it was great to see so many people engaged. The four of you are brilliant and inspiring. We learned a ton. So heartfelt thanks. As we mentioned earlier in the program, this has been recorded, so it will be shared and edited. And we encourage all of you who have seen this, and many of you have been doing this contemporaneously. We encourage you to share the Facebook edition of this with other Facebook groups, and we'll alert you all via email when the final episode is hosted by C21 the Turner, so that you can get that edited Director's Cut edition. If you're interested in supporting the Milwaukee Turners and our work, please visit us on Facebook or visit our website, milwaukeeturners.org. Also, if you're interested in becoming a sponsor of our ongoing Bell Phillips forums or seeing some of our previous episodes, you can find that on our website as well. A few quick announcements. And right in line with what the panelists were discussing, February 26th here at Turning Tables Tavern, the restaurant here at Turner Hall, although I believe the event is sold out, it's for the soul, a narrated food tasting and conversation with Judge Derek Mosley about his new role at Marquette University's Lubar Center. He's a notorious foodie for those of you who are calling in from out of state. We're also currently enrolling in our children's and youth gymnastics programs that's listed on our website. You can feel free to join us at Laughing Liberal Milwaukee at Comedy Sports Milwaukee, Saturday, March 11th from 8 to 10. That's in person. I believe I'll be the featured nonprofit speaker, and I'll perhaps be the tortured guest. You can find that on Facebook. And we invite all of you to join us. Adrian, we have a big commitment here at the Milwaukee Turners to confronting mass incarceration. So what you said about engaging with young people who are perhaps being tempted to be caught up into criminal legal activity or the criminal legal system is something as one of our pillars of our sustaining programs. And so March 28th, we'll be joining many other concerned folks from around the state for Wisconsin Day of Empathy in Madison at the Capitol, where we will be lobbying for needed changes to our criminal legal system. These links are being shared on Facebook and in the Zoom here if you're interested in attending. Until then, again, thank you all very much. And until next time, please take care of one another.
Yes. Here, thank you.